I want to, without further ado, introduce you to our keynote speaker. I've had the great pleasure of chatting with her about this presentation, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. Carolyn Finney has had a rich and varied career that should provide plenty of fodder for a great talk and great discussion. The aim of her work is to develop greater cultural competency within environmental organizations and institutions, challenge media outlets on their representation of difference, and increase awareness of how privilege shapes who gets to speak to environmental issues and determine policy and action. Carolyn is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa and Asia, and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a BA and MA focused on gender and environmental issues in Kenya and Nepal, respectively, and a PhD focused on African Americans and environmental issues in the U.S. She has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Cannon National Park Science Scholar, and a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Environmental Studies. She has had op-eds or interviews featured in a wide range of major media outlets, including The Tavis Smiley Show, MSNBC, NPR, Vice News Tonight, Outside Magazine, Newsweek, National Geographic, and the Boston Globe. She was a guest editor and contributor for a special section on race and the national parks in Orion magazine, and participated in a roundtable conversation with REI and The Atlantic. She even filmed a commercial for Toyota that highlighted the importance of African Americans getting out into nature. Along with public speaking, writing, consulting, and teaching positions at Wellesley College, the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Kentucky, and Middlebury College, she served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, assisting the Park Service in engaging in relations of reciprocity with diverse communities. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. So welcome, Carolyn. I'll say too that please enter any questions or comments that you have for Carolyn in the Q&A chat. She's going to be able to look at that after she finishes talking, and I may scan that and help her out, draw her attention to certain questions if she misses them. So don't hesitate to enter questions and comments as they arise, but she'll be addressing them at the end. All right, take it away, Carolyn.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. It's so odd. This is so odd because I can't see a single face, but I know that there are a lot of you out there, and I'm really grateful to be here today. I want to thank Rob. I want to thank everybody here at Massland who invited me and made it possible for me to participate with all of you and be in all of your living rooms. And you're in my lovely apartment in downtown Burlington, Vermont, on the land, the traditional lands of the Abenaki peoples. I'm very happy to be here today. So I got some stuff to say. So here's the deal. I'm going to be talking for a while. I'm going to show some images, tell some stories, give us some food for thought. And then we get to dive in. We're going to have at least a half an hour of conversation between us. And I just want to say in advance that all questions here are good questions, comments. Let's have a juicy conversation. So I am always lately, when I'm giving a talk, and I'm giving a talk or in running workshops or having these conversations multiple times a day, every day, and it's been pretty hardcore since last June. I always try to ground it in this moment, and to various degrees and in various ways, we've all been impacted in one form or another, either by the pandemic. Hopefully not directly, but some of us have been directly impacted by that. What has happened ever since George Floyd was murdered last summer, and the sort of opening of that door of conversation about systemic racism in this country, but also even politically, the way that the country has been revealed to be, and I say that in quotes, to be divided. Actually, what I always say to folks is that we've always been divided, and arguably we've been divided ever since Christopher Columbus lost his way. The way that it looks now, the way that we categorize it, the way that we notice it may be different, but this question of difference has always been on our plate here in this country. I think it's the thing at the center of what makes us who we are in the best ways. And I think it's also the center of our greatest challenge of how we are in good and better relationship, not only with this place itself, but also with each other. So a couple of things I want to say before I start talking very specifically about, my thoughts on race and the environment and DEI and sustainability and all those words and acronyms that we use to describe what it is that we want to do or that we say we want to do in this moment. I read an article a couple of weeks ago in the Paris Review, and in that article it was called Isn't Black Representation What We Wanted? When you see me look down, I'm just looking down at my notes. Isn't Black representation what we wanted? And the article was by an African-American writer named Maura Cheeks. And one of the things that Maura Cheeks was doing was talking about a conversation between Fran Lebowitz, the writer and public speaker, the Jewish writer and public speaker, and Toni Morrison, the late great Toni Morrison, the African-American writer. And first she starts off just quoting a conversation Fran Lebowitz was having, at first with Martin Scorsese. And Fran Lebowitz says, quote, "Why does everyone want to see themselves in books?" And she says she doesn't understand people who complain about not seeing themselves in books. She says, quote, "A book is supposed to be a door, not a mirror." Later, and this is what Maura Cheeks, right, the Black writer who wrote this article, said, "I understand the sentiment, but I disagree with its argument. It's the type of sentiment that can only be felt by someone who was unknowingly represented almost everywhere she turned. She didn't know what she had." A little bit later in the article, Maura talks about the conversation between Fran Lebowitz and Toni Morrison. Morrison says to Fran Lebowitz, "I am the reader of the books I write." And Fran Lebowitz responds, "Your other readers aren't you." And Morrison just laughs and says, "Yes, they are." So, I'm going to lay that out there for a minute. We'll come back to that in a bit. I want to talk about Lovecraft Country because I always want to talk about Lovecraft Country, but I want to talk about it in the context of what we're going to be talking about today. So I won't give away the plot here, but if you haven't watched this great Netflix HBO series, Lovecraft Country, you need to get on it immediately. I love science fiction. I thought this was one of the best series last year on television. So Lovecraft Country is based on the books of H.P. Lovecraft, and he wrote a lot of science fiction, also something called weird fiction, and HBO turned it into a series. Now, it's set in 1950s, right after the Korean War, and it focuses, in this case, on this expanded African-American family, and it starts off in Chicago, I should say. It goes back and forth between Chicago and Massachusetts, but it's based in Chicago. And in the opening episode, you're starting to get to know the characters in this extended Black family. I would say working class, working on up to middle class, but the working class Black family in Chicago in the 1950s. And it shows all of them getting ready to pile into this car that you see in front of you because they're going to go on this road trip. They're going on this road trip to Massachusetts because they've heard there's this rumor that they're related to this white family who knows magic and witchcraft, and there's all this stuff going on. It's like Indiana Jones, and they're going to go on this adventure and they're going to find out what's going on in Massachusetts. As they get into the car, the matriarch of the family is going to stay behind because they have a young child, and everybody's excited. It's a sunny day. Everybody's nervous the way you are when you're going to take a road trip. And she pulls out a book and she starts going through the list. She goes, "Let's just make sure you have everything you need right here in the car." And they kind of do a little checklist, and it's almost a throwaway. The thing that's always so powerful for me about that moment is what she's referencing is the Green Book. And the Green Book was a real thing. During the 1950s, it was Jim Crow, which meant that if you were non-white, in particular, if you were African-American, you had to think about it. You could take a road trip, but you better think about where you're going to stay. Is there going to be a restroom you can use, where you can get gas, and if you can't do all those things, what do you have with you in the car so you can take care of business the way you need to take care of business? Now, they weren't focused on that, but it was so powerful to me how it was part of this. It didn't diminish their excitement to get on the road, but it was a reality as Black people they had to consider. A little bit later in the episode, I think they're in Massachusetts, and they get pulled over by a white state trooper. And it's just before sundown. And he pulls them over, and he comes up to the car, and he says, "You know what time it is?" And they said, "Yeah, it's right before 7 o'clock." He said, "You are in a sundown county. You have 7 minutes to get out of here." Now, sundown counties, sundown towns were real things in this country. Some would say that they still exist in some places. And the idea here is if you were non-white, in particular, if you were Black and you were caught in a town after sundown, there was no telling what could happen to you. And folks doing it could get away with it. So he was telling them they had 7 minutes to get out of that county. Now, later, they fight real monsters in the woods. There's monsters with big teeth, and there's blood, and there's the whole 9 yards. But the thing for me that was so powerful about this moment was what happens when you center the story on non-white people, in this case, Black people in this country. The things that don't change is the joy, excitement, anxiety, the courage, the fighting, the whole sense of road trip that, many of us have experienced in our life. Because for me, that's a human thing, particularly it's an American thing as well, right? To take that road trip. But because they were Black, there were other considerations. They had to consider the Green Book and Jim Crow. They had to consider things like sundown counties. The monsters weren't only in the woods. They were also on the road. They were everywhere. They were within the fabric of that road trip. They didn't have the privilege of ignoring that because their lives were at stake in more ways than one. But it also didn't diminish their excitement and willingness to get on the road to do that. So what happens when we center the story differently on someone different from ourselves? And what is revealed about that? So I always start these conversations with a story about myself. And I do that not so I can simply talk about myself, but in part referencing that idea that it's a matter of perspective. We are all biased. I'm biased. You're biased. Everyone in here, Rob is biased. Everybody's biased, right? But bias is not the same as prejudice and racism. I actually think that they're kind of like close cousins. They sit next to each other. And if you're not aware of your own bias, it can tilt over into those other places. And so I think it's really important to be aware about, what your bias actually is. We all bring, I talk about all knowledge being subjective because we bring all of who we are to bear upon anything it is we're trying to understand in the world. And that goes with nature. It goes with the environment and parks and mountains and beaches and all of that. None of it is neutral through our own eyes because each of us are hardly neutral beings, right? We have a point of view. We have an emotional point of view, a spiritual point of view, a political point of view, a personal point of view. And so I tell everybody that this work for me is always personal. It's personal, it's political, it's intimate. For a variety of reasons, not the least of which because growing up as a Black girl, I had to take things in a very particular way. But more importantly, as a human being, right, it feels really intimate and close to me. So I want to tell you a little bit about my own story so you understand where my bias lies and how my point of view has been shaped. These are my parents up in the corner, Rose and Henry. That picture was taken in the 1950s. This story actually also starts right after the Korean War. My father fought in the Korean War. My parents actually grew up in Floyd, Virginia. And
Carolyn,
yeah?
Carolyn, it's Rob.
Yeah.
I just want to check and make sure people are seeing that slide. I'm still seeing the cover slide. Did you advance?
Yeah, I advanced. We're up 4 slides in.
Okay, Macy, are you seeing the slide that Carolyn is speaking to?
I am not, but I know another attendee is, so I think the attendees are seeing the slides advancing.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. All right. Okay, so it's only me who isn't seeing it. Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry, Rob. I'll share it with you later. So these are my parents, Rose and Henry, up in the corner. They grew up in Floyd, Virginia, which is near the Blue Ridge Mountains, near Roanoke. They grew up, they were both born in the 30s, so they were there in the 30s, 40s, 50s during Jim Crow. Very large families, very poor families. Both of them have a high school education. My dad went off to fight in the Korean War, and when he came back from the Korean War, I remember he told me that he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform, and he thought that looked like a great government job. So he went to apply, thinking, he had just come back. He was a veteran, but they told him, "We're sorry, we don't hire Negroes." So my father said it was at that point, like a lot of Black people who lived in the South at that time, they decided to move north. And they moved to New York. He had a sister who had moved up there who was a nurse and gotten married and seemed to be doing well. So he moved up there. He had 2 job offers. One was that he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is about 5 hours north of New York City. But the other was about 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. And you had a wealthy Jewish family who owned a 12-acre estate. They didn't live on it full time, but they needed people to live on it full time and be caretakers for that estate. And so my parents took that job. My father was the gardener. He was the chauffeur. My mom was the sometime housekeeper. What you're seeing up in the corner there is the gardener's cottage, which actually we lived in. I'll show you some other pictures in a minute. And in the corner, you see me in my little Sunday best outfit there, my little hat. My parents thought they wanted to have kids. They thought they couldn't have kids. And so they adopted me with the help of the owners. I was adopted through Spence Chapin, which is a Jewish adoption agency in New York City. And then what I always say to audiences that they relaxed and had my first brother, and they did some more relaxing and had my second brother. This is also that estate. You can't take a bad picture of this 12-acre estate. It had vegetable gardens, all kinds of fruit trees, peach, plum, pear trees, flower gardens, a wide variety of trees on this property. There was a pond with fish in it and a rowboat, a swimming pool, rock formations, woods, what you're seeing there, also the driveway. I mean, this was like its own kind of paradise. And because the owners, for the most part, were only there on weekends and holidays, my brothers and I had run of this place. We all knew how to swim by the time we were 7 years old. We had to learn how to swim because of the water on the property, and my parents were always worried we'd be out of sight and fall in. So we had to know how to save ourselves if that ever happened. We were always riding our bike outdoors, playing in the woods. I mean, this place was just, you can see here from this picture. This is the big house where, I called it the big house, where the owners would come up to and stay. And this is the pond that was right in front of there. So the story that I tell people about me getting a sense of myself as a Black person, there, and there were a lot of instances, but really 4th grade, I was walking home from school. I went to Mamaroneck Public School, which was largely Italian-American working class, some African-American working class. And I was walking home from school one day. So picture me, 9 years old, 4th grade, I was right around the corner from the house, and there were always policemen patrolling this area in their cars. And this white policeman stopped me in the car as I'm right around the corner, and he was asking me where I was going, and I gave him the address. And then he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I'm very confused because I'm not, right? And I just said, "No, I live there." And so then he let me go. I went home. I told my parents. My father was furious, and he called the police station, and he really gave them hell. That's all I can say. He really did. And asked them not to bother me and my brothers again. And they didn't after that. But as an adult, I have to question the logics behind what that policeman was seeing, thinking about his own bias, his point of view. He wasn't stopping and seeing a little girl coming home from school and thinking, how do I help that little girl make sure maybe she needs help getting home? He was questioning my right to be there. And I couldn't figure out why, except for the color of my skin. I want to jump ahead into the 90s. This is still the property. There's now gates on this property. So the owner, the patriarch of the family had died many years earlier. The matriarch of the family in the 90s got very sick. And so at this point, my parents have been caring for this land for 40 years. And to her credit, she wanted to try to figure out how to keep them on this land. This land was worth over $3 million at the time in the 90s. The property taxes alone were $125,000 a year. My dad had been making something like $20,000, $25,000 a year. And at the end of the day, in part because of the owner's grown children who were saying, no, that's not going to work. So I think she even considered paying the property taxes for them in perpetuity. She had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia. And the reason that they chose Leesburg was because at that point, my youngest brother was married with kids and had settled there. I was just moving around too much, never to settle, and so was my other brother. And so she had a beautiful house built for them in Leesburg on about a half an acre of land. She passed away with my father at her bedside, always a complicated story. And she passed away, father at her bedside. The new owner moved on. My parents stayed on the land because they always need people on this property caring for it full time. They eventually found a family who hailed from the Dominican Republic to move in. So in 2003, my parents now have been caring for that land for nearly 50 years full time. They left, moved down to their new home in Leesburg. And this is when I was working on my doctorate, right? Back in school working on my doctorate. And I shifted from thinking about gender and environmental issues abroad to thinking about issues of race and environment here at home, because it really became personal. A few years after that, my parents received a copy of a letter from one of their old neighbors. And the letter, which I have now, was from the Westchester Land Trust. It had pictures of the estate, and it talked about all the environmental values of this estate, and that a conservation easement was now being placed on this estate, which many of you out there already know that means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. I actually didn't know anything about land trusts and conservation easements before actually experiencing it personally. So at the letter, which is about 2 pages long, it touts all the reasons why this estate's going to be protected, the flora and fauna, where it sits in the watershed. And at the end, it thanks the new owner for his conservation mindedness. He's been on the land now, I would say, maybe 5 years, 6 years. There's nothing in the letter thanking my parents, who'd cared for that land for nearly 50 years, full time. Just like that, they were erased from the environmental history of this place. So now when I think about the mainstream environmental movement that's often good-naturedly saying we need to reach out to Black and brown people, we need to engage them, as though they're not engaged, as though they don't already have some embodied knowledge, as though they don't care, right? I have to look back at my parents who knew that land better than the owners for 50 years, actually. And I watched my dad in particular spiral in a depression and talk about missing that land. It's why I started asking, like, whose ownership counts? Whose presence count? Whose labor counts when we talk about land and environment? And when we say public lands, even though this is private, when we say public lands, what public are we talking about? Is it some universal mass public? Or is it actually made up with people with different histories, different points of view, depending on where they're standing, based on the experience of who they are in a country that has always challenged each of us because of who we are around the issue of difference. And we've always challenged each other about that. What does that look like in this larger conversation? So then I think about this moment of convergence, right? And I always put up this slide because I feel like we're always at a moment of convergence, but there's something about this moment, right, that's kind of out of the water and really different. You see, I have these images here of people enslaved, immigrants crossing the border, Japanese internment, indigenous removal, pollution that happens to land. And I have all those images, but right at the top of the slide, I have 2 famous images, black and white images. One of Gifford Pinchot, who founded the Forest Service and this idea of managing the resources for our use, this idea of conservation. That picture, I believe, is late 1800s. And then the famous picture of John Muir and President Roosevelt on overhanging rock in Yosemite in 1903. Here they are, I imagine, having conversations about ideas of wilderness and protection and national parks and representing ourselves to the world. And the thing for me is not to diminish the experiences of these men and the commitment these men had to an idea of what our relationship as human beings to non-human nature should look like. But the thing that I question is what else was going on at the same time? Because even though they were talking in universal terms, because their privilege allowed them to do so, that is not what was happening for everybody else, right? In 1862, a few years earlier, I like to talk about the Homestead Act because for me, that relationship to land got codified in a very particular way at that time. And all the things behind that curtain also got codified as well. So when that gun went off at midnight and people of European descent, for the most part, could run out and put their stake down to up to 160 acres of land. And if they stayed on it for 5 years, and if they farmed, and if they built a shelter, then that land was theirs free and clear. Right? And land is never just about land. It's about economic and political power. It is about legacy. It is about the right to say you belong here. Right? So I don't like to take anything away from them either, right? Because many of them didn't make it. Something like 60% did not survive. The risk that many of them took just coming over from their home and trying out something new in a new place. You know, as a human being, I can only look at them with great admiration for taking that kind of risk. And I also have to ask the question, who had to be removed from that land in order for them to have that opportunity? Who had to be removed and sometimes killed? And 3 years later, Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans were freed and initially were given 400,000 acres of land. It's where the term 40 acres and a mule comes from. Until some white plantation owners, I guess, sat down and thought about what they were doing and said, we just gave 400,000 acres of land to people we had enslaved as our property. Land is never just about land. It's about economic and political power. It's about legacy. It is about the right to say you belong. I don't think so. And they snatched all that land back. And while you did have a few African-American homesteaders, for the most part, they weren't able to participate in the Homestead Act the same way people of European descent could participate. So we don't even have to go any farther. This is what I'm talking about, codified. We can draw a straight line, in my opinion, from that moment all the way to this one, when we have conversations about land, environment, ownership, place, perspective, justice, sustainability. You know, I always ask the question, well, what is it that we're trying to sustain? It's like we don't necessarily interrogate that. We just take it at face value that, well, we want to save that river or protect that piece of land. I said, who's the we? And what about that relationship in the we? Who gets to decide what's protected and how it's protected and the meaning behind it? Who gets to make those decisions? You know, what about the collective? And how do we do that differently and better? So, you know, I love this James Baldwin quote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. It's simple and straightforward. And I think it's for real here. It's why so many of us, you know, want to look back at history, because wherever you go, there you are. You know, what'll always be true in this country is the two original sins, right? That all this land was stolen. And that we enslaved another group of people to work this land for free to build the backbone of our economy. The blood is in the soil, which isn't to say that there haven't been a whole lot of marvelous things that have happened, because there are. That's the amazing thing, because we're human beings, right? We're complicated. We can do a good thing and then we can do a not so good thing over here. But it's also interesting how we turn away. Well, I should say those of us who are privileged to do so can ignore or turn away or not be aware of or not center their lives around it, because their lives are not centered there. When we talk about this idea of white supremacy, it's, in one sense, it's the idea that whiteness is centered as a perspective. Whiteness is not a bad thing. I say it over and over again. Nobody can help the skin that they were born in. So it's not about good or bad. That's not even a useful conversation, in my opinion. But it's the idea that it becomes a privileged perspective, a privileged filter to see life. It doesn't diminish the hard work that all kinds of diverse white people have put into creating their life. It doesn't diminish that at all. But actually, the playing field looks wholly different when you are centered and don't even know it, right? You can talk about the universal. You know, if one group is centered, what's inferred here is a whole bunch of others are marginalized. I got to tell you, I don't like being marginalized. I don't even like using the term. It assumes a sort of lesser than position, a less valued one, a less affirmed one. It makes space for erasure. ignoring, dismissal, appropriation, all the ways within which we can leave out all kinds of other experiences and stories, like my family's and maybe yours listening, right? I don't know who's here today. So this is like a station break here. So I call this my metaphorical afro, and all of you have metaphorical afros at this moment. I'm picturing all the afros in the room. And I carry a lot of things around in my afro. And right now, all the time here is, for me, the pandemic and the conversation that arose from George Floyd's murder, and when Christian Cooper walked into Central Park and had his skin weaponized against him. But they're not the only things there. What's also true is I carry a lot of other people around my head that inform me in good ways, and people from all walks of life. And this is just a handful of people here. You could see Toni Morrison and Spike Lee, but also I love me some Carl Sagan and Jane Goodall and others. Just play with me for a minute. The other two that are really relevant for me right now are Greta Thunberg as well. And in multiple ways, I think Greta Thunberg is an amazing human being. And I also have issues in which the way that, in terms of representing the youth, as though she's the one who started this, when you've got youth of color around the world who've been doing this longer than her and haven't been promoted or represented in the same way, and the problems with that. There's also movements and ideas, when I think about the American Indian movement, or Angela Davis and the Black Power movement, and Spike Lee and his cultural, the stories he tells culturally, and the Me Too movement. Now, I know this is because, just play with me, but there's also people in my head that I wish weren't in my head, but they show up all the time for various reasons and stories. And finally, I'm going to get to this. I just really wanted to show you the fact that I did have an afro, along with my overplucked eyebrows. So, Bamboozled. The opening chapter of my book, I'm not going to stay here very long. I borrowed titles from Spike Lee's movies on purpose. In his movie Bamboozled, he was talking about the way we've been bamboozled around African Americans and African American stereotypes in the media. For me, I think we've been bamboozled about the environmental narrative in this country. The idea that somehow everything else, we talk about manifest destiny, settling, ideas of wilderness that we created the national parks, all those things we did. We did do all those things. It's true, we did them. But that somehow we can just skirt talking about Jim Crow segregation, right? All the racism that's in place that was going on at the same time, redlining, all the ways which those processes and moments in history informed how non-white people could show up and engage. Because, it didn't make any difference if you were going to a beach or going on a hike or going to maybe have a picnic in a park. It didn't make any difference. You didn't suddenly walk through a magical green door and suddenly race didn't matter. Even though sometimes, and I say this very gently, mainstream organizations would tell you that, because it didn't matter. There were only certain beaches Black people could go to. You could still be risking your life. At the maximum, at the bare minimum, you could be dealing with some sense of insecurity about, is this a safe place? And often it had nothing to do with how much you might have loved being on the land, right? And being there and feeling connected in your own way. I want to go back to the issue of representation for a minute. I'm watching my time. Okay. I want to go back to the issue of representation for a minute. I like to put this up, and you may be wondering what LeBron James has to do with this conversation. So this cover of Vogue is from 2010, and it's LeBron James, the first time an African-American man was placed on the cover. He's with the supermodel Gisele Bündchen. And when this came out, a lot of Black people got upset. So, on Twitter and everything else, people were, talking about how upset they were, because they said, you finally put a Black man on the cover and that's pretty fabulous, but why does he look so primitive? I want you to think about the recent conversation over Kamala Harris, I believe was on the cover of, it's either Vogue or Vanity Fair, and how upset people got about that as well, right? In this case, they were upset, Black people, about LeBron because it's great you've got him on the cover, but he looks so primitive. Then somebody uncovered the poster you see next to it, Destroy This Mad Brute. That poster is from 1917. I want you to look at the poster right down to the color of the woman's dress in both images. Now, the people who put together the magazine, the cover said they didn't know anything about that poster. And in all honesty, I truly don't believe that, right? That's some kind of coincidence. But even if they didn't know, for me, there's some revelation here about what's buried in our consciousness, about the way within which Black and brown people throughout history have been diminished in terms of thinking of them as human beings. So yes, being seen as close to nature, but not in the way that many mainstream folks talk about now, with pride that they're close to nature. It's like more animal-like and less than human, less than human, less than human. In the late 1800s, there would be world's fairs, opportunities for communities to get together to see, who are we going to be? What's innovative? How are we going to move forward? How are we going to be closer to God? Because that point of view, that spiritual and religious point of view, was privileged. And at those world's fairs, you also had Black and brown people on display as the thing we want to move away from. I like to think about the American Museum of Natural History in New York, one of my favorite museums, because it was the first museum I'd ever gone to as a kid. And back in the same time, someone had discovered a young man in the Congo named Odabanga, and they brought him back. They put him on display at the American Museum of Natural History to represent the missing link. And because museum curators thought enough of the public wouldn't see him, they moved him to the primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo. They did this to a lot of people. It wasn't just one here, one there. I want to jump ahead to the first self-identified African-American man in the White House, President Obama. I don't want to talk about Obama, but I want to talk about the public conversation started to shift. So when you hear Glenn Beck, the conservatives talk show host, talk about Obama's Planet of the Apes, when you hear about the white woman in West Virginia who, I believe she ran some nonprofit, but she started talking about Michelle Obama as an ape in heels. When the stimulus bill comes out and on the cover of the New York Post or inside the New York Post, Sean Delonis does a full-size cartoon of a dead chimpanzee with a sign that says stimulus bill pinned to his chest and two white cops with smoking guns standing over it. I want to talk about the watermelon patches in front of the White House. I mean, it goes on and on, right? The dehumanization of people in arguably the highest position in the land. Now, think about that. If they're willing to do it publicly to the highest position in the land, what chance do the rest of us have of being seen as fully human? And this is old news, not new news. It's new representation, but it's an old story about Black and white people being seen as less than human, closer to nature, which complicates that human-nature relationship that the mainstream environmental movement often promotes. And let me just say as an aside, the idea that we're separate from nature is also problematic, right? That we don't see ourselves as part of the ecosystem, but I'm not even going to go there right now. Something else I want to put out there is this idea of outreach, which I know that outreach comes from a really good place. I believe that most of the time, as someone who's been outreached to in her life, and I find outreach highly problematic. So let me tell you this story about Brenda Palms Barber. Brenda Palms Barber, maybe 20 years ago now, she was from Denver, and she got a call from some folks in Chicago who said, we have some previously incarcerated Black men and women. They come out of jail, and they're going to need a job. Can you help us think about what that would look like? So she felt, yes, I can do that, but I'm going to have to move there, become part of the community. She did. And speaking with the community, she had a business background, right? So she was thinking with the community. They thought of things like landscape gardening, which seemed like a pretty good idea, or driving around the elderly. All these seemed like really good ideas, but I don't know. She said she didn't feel a spark, man. She didn't think it had legs. And one day she was having a random conversation with a friend who was talking about beekeeping. And she said, like, the light bulb went off, and she said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make urban honey on the west side of Chicago. And she said people basically thought she was crazy. In the end, she created a very successful business called Sweet Beginnings, which makes honey and honey-related products in Chicago. And you can find the products online and Whole Foods, and all the rest is out there. But the story that I want to tell is what happened when she started the company. The first year, she didn't realize she was running a green business. She didn't even know what that meant. finally, I guess friends looked and said, you're running a green business because you don't feed your bees sugar derivatives. You're acting locally. And everybody who works for this company has to know the life cycle of the bee. It doesn't matter whether you went to school or not, or how many degrees you have or no degrees. You have to know the life cycle of the bee. You have to understand that. But the story that I really like is when she would talk about interviewing some of these young men and women for a job. So she would say there would be one of these young Black people sitting in front of her. So picture a young Black man, for instance. And she would say, so you're looking for a job? And they'd say yes. And she'd say, so you just got out of jail? And they were less forthcoming, but they'd say, yeah. And she said, so what were you in jail for? And they might respond, well, for selling drugs. And she said she would do a dramatic pause. Were you good at it? And they would kind of be taken back a little bit and then say, yeah, I was. And she said, so what were you good at? And they say, well, I understood the value of my product and also of my customer base and everything they rattled off. She said, that is fabulous. We're going to transfer that knowledge, that embodied knowledge, and we're going to move it here to this legal activity of making honey and honey related products. The thing I love most about that for her, it wasn't about outreaching to them and assuming, even in the best way, that they were empty vessels that needed new knowledge. They actually had a knowledge base that they could bring. They were already fully formed, which isn't to say they could not change and grow. But instead, she was interested in building a relationship of reciprocity, of recognition. I always say to folks that outreach usually means I can outreach to you, right? I bring you to my table and I'm a nice person, right? And I make space for you there. And I really welcome you. I'm genuine about that, right? I welcome you. You sit down at the table. And then what you have to proceed to do is you have to learn everything about the table. The mission statement, the table, the culture around the table, the way we talk about it, the way we show up. We don't actually have to learn anything about you. Nothing at the table changes except that we made a little space for you. But you are being asked to assimilate. Now, diversity is not about assimilation. And what I say to people now all the time is, if you are actively, genuinely interested in engaging diversity, difference, broadly defined, then you need to be prepared to change. My latest favorite saying to say now is, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I'm not here to diminish the experience of many who worked hard, who believe in what they do, and have their own embodied knowledge to bring, because we need everything. We need everything on the table. But I am saying you do need a new bathtub. If you think you can do what you're doing and bring difference in, and it's going to work. Oh, you know what? We've been trying that for like the last 50 years. And here we are, folks. Here we are having the same conversation again. I'm not saying we haven't made some progress, but let's be real for a moment. Black people, brown people, we are still using or dying at worst, and at best are living in this kind of insecure world. We're still having conversations where we're looking at the staff of major environmental organizations that do not represent the difference out there. I'm not privileging race and ethnicity in this conversation because that's where my bias is, but there's all kinds of difference. The difference we can see and all the differences we cannot. If we are not changing, how do we expect to have a real relationship of change and difference and reciprocity around the issue of difference? And what do we miss and lose by not having that experience? I've got about 2 more stories, and then I'm going to stop talking, I think. I think I'm right. Yeah, I got time here. I want to talk about John Muir a little bit. One of the things that happened last summer, and I'm sure some of you remember this, is the articles that were coming out in the Washington Post and elsewhere with the headlines about John Muir being racist. And I remember when this happened, this is going to sound weird, right? I had a moment of glee. And what I meant by that was, I've been saying that already for 4 years about John Muir, right? Because it's in his writing. Now, I am not interested in diminishing John Muir at all. I think John Muir was also an incredibly thoughtful and committed man when it came to non-human nature. And I've been influenced by John Muir in a myriad of ways. And I'm not interested in canceling anybody out. I think cancel culture is lazy. I think it's actually not doing the work of coming together across our differences and seeing what is possible. That is a lot harder to do than just saying, putting the hand up, right? And that John Muir, first and foremost, was a human being with very particular set of privileges. And I'm not saying he shouldn't be held accountable. I'm all about accountability and what that looks like. But how do we do that? And to what end? What is our intention? Because I believe that I can speak for myself at least, but I've certainly made mistakes. And when they're discovered, am I going to be canceled because of that? Or is there going to be an opportunity for reconciliation, redemption, and then real change that is embedded in an authentic understanding of who we are, and more importantly, who we can become, right? And how do we create that vision together? So, yeah, I think that's what I really wanted to say about him. There's a lot of other things I want to say. When all of those articles came out, I was reached out to by the great-great-grandson of John Muir, Robert Hanna. And I had only met him once briefly before, but he reached out to me and asked me to be on his podcast to talk about it. And the reason was because when all those articles came out, he was getting calls from all the mainstream media and, to his family wanting a response. And he just did not want to deal with them. So when I came on the podcast, he starts off the podcast by introducing me to his audience. And he says, so the idea for this podcast came up because my phone was buzzing off the hook from CNN and everybody else who wanted me to respond. He says it was really disconcerting. He goes, it was like something that happened to a member. I thought something that happened to a member of my family. And I interrupted him and I said, well, something did happen to a member of your family. That's the thing I think we often forget. I said something did happen to a member of your family. It's understanding the legacy isn't simply what's been passed down at this national scale or even at the statewide scale or the citywide scale or the townwide scale. It's family. Part of that legacy is what's in our DNA for some of us, in the bodies we carry, but also in the DNA of who we are in relationship with each other. And for me, it is important to think about how we heal that, right? Because he's in my DNA too, whether or not I want to, whether I like it or not, he's there too. And we can talk about this later. So I'm working on a one-woman show where I imagine myself in conversation with him in part. And I realize this so I can heal as well. But I want to discover what happens when you bring both of our narratives together. That's actually the truer narrative of who we are when talking about environmental narrative, not his narrative versus my narrative or anybody else's. It's actually all of ours. And the work is consistent and always us coming together and figure out how we stand right in that place of tension. So the last thing I want to say here is that for me, we're always playing the long game. Right? We're always playing the long game. And I put up this famous picture that many of you have probably seen since the inauguration of Landscape with Rainbow that was painted by Robert S. Duncanson, an African-American painter in 1859. Actually, he was of European ancestry and African ancestry. And I had never heard of Robert S. Duncanson before the inauguration when Roy Blount presented this painting to Joe Biden at that time. And I couldn't even watch it. I had to look up and see. I was like, what is going on here? The reason I was so blown away by this painting is because it's pretty bucolic looking. It looks like a lot of the landscape paintings we see from that time that painted this idea of the serenity and the sublimeness of the natural landscape, of the natural American landscape. What blew me away was this is a man living in a brown body during the time of slavery, and he's painting a rainbow, which is symbolic of hope and the future and potential. And I'm like, how was he holding that? I read that he dealt with, he had a lot of mental illness, that the prejudice, I can only imagine, was eating away at him, that he was often going over to Canada. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like to live in his body at that time as a free man, when so many other people who look like him were not free, and still be hopeful about what the future is. And I'd like to believe that's because he was playing the long game. He was thinking of this world without him and the possibilities of it. I was born exactly 100 years after he painted this. And so I believe I also became possible because of that. And so the very last thing I want to say to all of you is I always ask the question, what are we willing to risk in order to gain? And taking a risk in order to gain is very different from taking a risk because you're afraid of not losing something. I think that, that idea that, well, I want to hold on to something, so I'm going to fight everything else so I can keep what's mine because I want it to be mine. I think that's something that we're really good at. But to take a risk for something you can't see yet, that you don't know what it looks like, you're not even quite sure how it is you're supposed to do it, that's next level risk taking, right? And I think that's what this work calls for. How do we create that emergence space, which means that we're coming together on faith, right? Whatever that means to all of you out there, because we believe in our better selves. This is not about being comfortable, right? I always tell the story I heard on a number of years ago on NPR when Michelle Martin was talking to Svetlana Alexievich, who had recently won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. And she's from Belarus. And she told some real truths about her people that aren't pretty. And a lot of her people back in Belarus were really upset with her. And this is what Michelle Martin was saying to her. She said, you made a lot of your people uncomfortable. And Svetlana Alexievich's response was, I love my people, but I'm not interested in my people being comfortable. I'm interested in my people being better. So my question for all of you is, what does that work look like? How do we continue to play the long game? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's excellent, Carolyn. So if you click on share, you'll come on.
I did.
Okay, it may take a little bit.
Okay.
But you can go ahead and take a look at the Q&A. There's just a couple questions in there right now, but I'll invite people to continue contributing questions if they have any. There, Richard Kerber asks, you're such an incredibly good speaker. Could you tell us another story of how you came to this?
I love it. You mean all the stories I told you weren't enough? I love to tell stories. Another story of how I came to this. Well, I will say to you that, aside from the place where I grew up, what was always clear for me, my heart is embedded in the arts. I knew from the time I was 14 that at the time I wanted to go into the theater. I knew that's where I wanted to go, but I was also going to be the first in my family to go to college. And my parents, my father in particular, wasn't having it. So it was a big fight, for a long time, actually. And when I first went to college, I loved school, but I really wanted to do theater, and he wouldn't let me. When you come from a family that doesn't know that you can go to college and major in theater and it's okay because you're still taking a whole lot of other courses, but we didn't have the ability to discuss this back in the 70s because nobody knew that. So he just would not let me major. So when I went to school, I went at SUNY Oswego. I applied to state, it had to be New York State because that was what my parents could afford. I applied to 6 schools. I got in all of them, and I picked the one that was farthest away so that I could, because my father was very strict. So growing up, man, I wasn't allowed to go to sleepaway camp. Actually, my brothers, because I was a girl, my father had very specific ideas. And even though I had been a Girl Scout and all these other issues, and there's a lot of stuff there. So I was looking for freedom with a capital F, right? And when I first got to school, I'd always done well in school, but I was so overwhelmed with the responsibility of that freedom. In my first year, I was 17 that I flunked out my first year. Actually, I just did. And I was mortified. And my high school principal called me in, and it was so humiliating because he was like, your IQ is this and you should be. This is the kind of stuff they'd say to you back in the 70s. And I got back in. He got me back in. But in my second year, I did better. I said, you know what? This isn't what I want to do. I'm going to drop out and I'm moving to New York City. I was almost a cliche. I had a boyfriend who was a bass player. Oh, yes, I did. And so I moved to New York, and actually for the next 11 years, I got really serious. Survival jobs, I got agents, I did commercials, I studied theater. I took it on my own, made peace with my family because they said, oh, she's serious. She's not, my father really used to say she's going to become a prostitute and do drugs and die. He'd say that. And I'm like, there's nothing of that in my background, but he was just, his own fear was, out there in full form. I love, the creative world. What I didn't like was the business. This was the 80s when I was, back in my 20s. And, as a brown skin, I used to have to straighten my hair, and I was doing fairly well. But I, saw that finding parts for me, it was a lot harder for the way that I looked at that time for all the reasons that all of us knew. I also got married. My first overseas trip, I booked my first commercial, made some money, and I took it and bought a Euro pass when I was 22 and decided I wanted to go to Europe. I'd never been, and I went to England. I met this amazing guy. I stayed 6 months. Romance is always involved. We came back 2 years later. We got married. We were married too young. That's the whole story. But in 1987, when the marriage really wasn't working, instead of going to therapy like most people do, we decided we'd take a backpacking trip around the world, because at the time when Pan Am was still around, you could buy around the world ticket for $2,500. That is one of those moments, like we all have them in our lives, that changed everything for me. Like we did this trip. First of all, I'd never, England had been the one place I'd been, but I'd never been. I mean, this is when we were going to India and Thailand and Israel and Egypt and places that I'd only seen in books. That changed my life. A couple of things happened. One, I didn't actually like who I saw myself becoming, doing theater, doing modeling, all that stuff. The focus on the physical and my value and worth embedded in that came right up against that part of me who had been brought up, doing all the civic engagement as a Girl Scout and volunteerism in a very particular way that I seemed to be thinking about myself all the time. And I didn't like that. I'd also become quite fearful. I didn't want to do anything without my husband. Like I couldn't do it on my own. And I had been this really independent person as a woman, right? As a self-identified woman. So I didn't like those things. I fell in love with travel and everything that it was exposing. So when we came back, it didn't save the marriage, but I took a year, I was going on auditions and working to save my money to see if I could do it by myself. And that's when I did 6 months backpack through East and Southern Africa. And I just had to prove I could do it. And then I went back again to Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And then I thought, well, I shouldn't just be traveling. I should be engaged and involved. But I said, Peace Corps will never hire me because I never finished my undergraduate degree. And I just felt really, intimidated by even applying. So at the end of it, a friend said, why don't you just pick a place you've been to and go live there, go settle, get to know the people and the place. And I had been to Nepal only briefly on that around the world trip for 2 weeks. And I picked Nepal. I did some reading and I went back and ended up staying there a year and a half. And so I say all of that sense of myself in the world, I still wasn't thinking environmental, I was just thinking of myself in relationship to place and land and everything that I was seeing. And when I'd go trekking and, some of the lens I was seeing the world through was through that recreational lens, where you can go on hikes and treks. And I did a lot of that kind of stuff. But the other piece of it was the labor, because I came from a family whose relationship to the land was embedded very firmly in labor of it, right? Working the land. And a lot of people that I were meeting, like in Nepal, that's also how their relationship in part was shaped, right? So I was getting to know that and understand that and think about that in very particular ways. When I came back and decided to return to school in my mid-30s to finish my undergraduate degree, the thing that was also clear to me is I went to go see the Black actress Anna Devere Smith. Now this was early mid-90s. So if you don't know her, you do. You've seen her TED Talk. She's been in 1,000 TV shows and movies. But the thing she got known for and is known for best as a playwright. She does all these one-woman shows. And she did her first one-woman show in New York called Twilight Los Angeles, where she had gone to LA after the riots. And I had lived in LA and moved out 3 days before the LA riots. And she interviewed all these people. And then she played something like 42 different characters herself on Broadway. She just did it. I went to see that, right? I had just moved back from Nepal, was about to move out to Washington State to go back to school. And I went and saw that play. And I went, she told all these stories from different perspectives and held them in relationship to each other. And I went, that's what I want to do. I didn't know how it was, but I said that right there. And then as I got to learn more about the environment broadly defined as I was back in school, I said, I want to do that. Also thinking about the environment, like in place and land, because all those relationships are informed and together. And how do we have that conversation across our differences? How do we hold all those stories? What is revealed by all those stories? What's the healing that can happen? I was kind of grandiose, for everyone, but really, honestly, what's the healing that can happen for me as someone who's adopted, who doesn't know if I have any connection to anybody, I'm driven entirely and honestly by the idea of belonging and identity and relationship. I mean, it's just there. I'm just telling y'all, and I don't even know y'all, but that's just the truth. And I've just found a way, because I know I'm not alone in that, and a way within which, how do we stand up with each other at that moment in genuine, authentic relationship? So that's sort of another story that got me here. This is what I do. I mean, I've been working to build this public platform for years. I've come up against academic institutions that recruit me, but actually want me to assimilate, in these environmental departments, natural resources. I'll be the only one who looks like me, or one of the only ones in these large departments. And the fight becomes over, but we need you to do it like this. And I'm like, yeah, but if I can't do it like that. What saved me in part was because I was an older student. So by the time I'm getting jobs, I'm in my late 40s, and I already am really clear I did not borrow all this money to go back to school. That money for me is my second mortgage. I probably will never get to own a home, because I made a clear choice. I understood, as somebody who is not wealthy, that this is what I'm going to do, and this is the way that I'm going to do it. And I have to make choices about how I'm going to do that. I mean, so I would say the last few years, I'm normally on a plane every week. I might be teaching a class somewhere, and then later in the week I get on a plane to go have these conversations, and I have to be invited. But the invitations, ever since the book came out 6 years ago, have been pretty nonstop. And then last summer, when everything started going down here, right in the country, George Floyd's murder, and I was asked to write a piece in The Guardian, my inboxes, and I have 3 of them, exploded, right? And so I'm both grateful for the opportunities to write and expand, and the money and the resources. I also have to say, because I have to give a shout out to Middlebury College, when folks at Middlebury reached out to me a year and a half ago, the reason I'm living in Vermont is because they also wanted me to come here. I was in Kentucky at that point, and I said, I don't want a full-time job in an academic institution, because what happens is I get, then all my attention goes to fighting to survive within that institution so they don't assimilate me like the Borg in Star Trek, right? I said, let's work out what we might want to do together, what you say you want and need and what I want. We took 6 months. The wonderful Nan Jinks at the time was a dean there. We came up. I said, let's think of it on the model of an artist residency. I'd like it to only be part-time so that the other work I do in the world can be connected, but there's space for that. They agreed to it. I said, and this for me is what institutional change and people using their power. She used her power. She got the money. She knew got the language down to work it out. I am sitting here today because there's a place and space for this. To trust that actually this has value. And none of us knew the pandemic and the racial reckoning was coming. So,
Carolyn,
yeah.
Carolyn, that's great. The questions are definitely populating. Okay. So let's see if we can get through as many of these as possible. Lee Youngblood has a question here. As we increase inclusion, are there ways you find the term asset framing helpful?
Oh gosh, I'm not even sure I know what that is. The reason I don't, so it's a good question. And so a few things, words. Inclusion actually needs to be unpacked. I have to tell you all, just the whole diversity, equity, inclusion thing, it's hard for me. I hear it and I get just tired. I understand why we create our acronyms and it gets used, because let's start with inclusion first before I even get to the asset framing. Inclusion implies the including of someone in something that already exists, as though the thing that already exists doesn't need to change. So my question to you then is, what is it that we're including someone in? What am I being included in? What are you being included in? The very first thing, the very first action, I work with a lot of different organizations around this, is the internal assessment within that organization itself. How do you assess, in terms of you can hire somebody to do racial equity assessments or to look at your own organization. How do we start to unpack what's going on here, as though, this is throwing out the bathtub. What does that look like? Mission statements that got created 50 years ago when people like me weren't being considered to be part of that, even in the best of terms, right? How do we revisit? Not forget what we've done before, but where are we now? Who's sitting at the table and making decisions? Remember, we're all biased. So if it's a fairly homogenous group of people with respect to the idea we're all different and unique, I know that. And if it's a fairly homogenous group of people making the decision, how do you expect, or we expect to come up with something different? What does it look like to engage in, say, we're in new visioning with people who are going to bring something different, which is going to mean we're all going to benefit because it's going to come together. And it's like, oh, that's what a space of emergence looks like, because we got some new stuff in the room. You know, it's like if you're cooking something up on the stove and if you keep putting in the same spices, but you hoping you're going to get a different taste. How are you going to get a different taste if you're not putting in anything different or taking out something, changing it up completely, you know, to see what might emerge differently. So I'm not even sure what asset framing is. I could guess what it means and think that, you know, look at what assets we have or what assets we need. That feels, and I could be really wrong and I apologize, it feels really transactional. It doesn't feel like it's grounded in relationship building, right? How about, I learned a few weeks ago from a wonderful man named Sam Grant. He's an African-American man who's the new executive director for 350.org in Minneapolis. And I met him because of Bill McKibben. And he came up with this idea, and I loved it, the idea of assessing the ecosystem of relationships that you have as an organization. And I'm like, oh, yes, that's it right there, right? So you're thinking about it as a larger ecosystem, but looking at your relationships. And how do you tend to those relationships? What ones are really need your attention? And what is your capacity to attend to those relationships? What are the shortcomings? Where are the tensions? What are the relationships that are actually the ones you've been privileging that maybe you shouldn't be? And those are the ones that need to go on the back burner, because these ones over here that we're going to be really uncomfortable about dealing with, this is actually where we need to stand. Again, and who might work with us to do that? Who do we need to be in a relationship with in order to attend to that differently, to grow our own capacity? And here's the brilliant thing. We are so multi-talented. We don't have to do this only in a linear fashion. We can be thinking about that complexity really differently. And I'm not saying that everyone can do everything at the same time, but this is also assessing the strengths that already exist. You know, this is the baby in the bathwater, right? Well, how many babies we got up in here? And what can all these babies do? And what are there may be things about those babies that we think we already know. I can't believe I keep using babies as the analogy, but since I started there, I have to keep going. What are the strengths that we've never noticed before and we haven't used? What is it about the way that we even think about our leadership framework? Is it we've got one? You know, at the top is the hierarchy, and then we work our way down. Ooh, that model can be kind of limiting when we think about where it is we're saying we want to go. What does it look like to kind of shift and think about co-leadership models? Oh, what about our budget? Wait a minute. Where are we getting our money from, by the way? What philanthropy? Who do we have access to? And we're talking about some of these organizations of color who've been doing it, in some cases, longer than we have. What would it mean to change that dynamic? What does that look like? There are things that will be lost here. It is about giving up something. There is no, I'm going to just be, you know, I've gotten to a point now where I feel really confident to say that you are not going to be able to keep everything you have to get everything you say you want. You're just not going to be able to do it. So how prepared are you to let go of some of that power, resources, position that you have in order to gain that greater thing that you're saying that you want, you know, which means in part, you need to define what that is.
Carolyn, this is, let me jump in, and I'm going to give you a group of 3 questions that are kind of related, and you can respond. So one is from Katrina Amaral, and it's, you know, is there any work in the environmental field, projects, partnerships, organizations that you find particularly inspiring right now? And, you know, related sort of potentially question, from Johnny Robinson. Do you have a great example of an organization getting a new bath and doing away with the basic outreach approach? And
Yes.
and then the last question that's kind of related is from Liz Newlands. Can you share more thoughts about this outreach, point that you've made? Maybe organizations want to build a bigger tent and bring people in, but maybe they need a different tent, So those three questions, maybe you can tie together somehow.
I already forgot the first one. Sorry, it's just hard for me I was trying to write it down.
Good examples. Is there anybody out there that's doing it well in the environmental, or organizations or projects that inspire you?
Yes, actually, the Sustainability Guild in Boston. I sit on their board, the Sustainability Guild. Some of you may know the Sustainability Guild. Jana Sexian is an African-American woman who started the guild. I don't even know where to begin with the building, with their working in Black neighborhoods to create this, oh God, I wish I had it pulled up because I could tell you more about the details, creating everything from how they built the building and getting Black architects to grounding in community, to bringing in the arts, to thinking about, LEED certification, to how they deal with the city and the money that they're getting. Every aspect of it, even the way we run the board, is actually different. And everything is interrogated, so it takes longer. And there's also the sense that at the center of it is right relationship and determining what that is. Look up the Sustainability Guild, or sometimes it just goes by the Guild in Boston. It, for me, is the project right now in the organization that is really finding a different way. And in part, when Jana came to it, she was at Harvard and she left Harvard and said, this is what I'm doing. Again, that same impulse that in some institutions, the biggest challenge is the rigidity of those institutions to get in the way of that innovation and also that change that's needed. So that's my short answer to that. I know those were three questions and they were all kind of bundled together, but that's my short answer as an example. I also want to say that I've been working, there's so many organizations right now that I'm working with. Some are really well known. Some of them are outdoor retailing businesses, nonprofits, botanical gardens, museums, art basins. It's just that are really trying to think differently about it. And my optimism is because of so many people who are genuinely thinking about it for their own organization, institution, agency, and the way that they move forward. And I understand, and I'm not naive, that for some it may be a little more symbolic. And for some, it's at the end of the continuum. But I think for a lot, it's a process of discovering not just what's out there in the world and what they should be doing, but more importantly, discovering who they actually are. And the thing that I have great empathy for is that for a lot of predominantly white organizations, that coming to terms with the fuller who you are or what you might represent is a little overwhelming, because when you believe in all the good things, that good intention has always been there, right? But actually, that's not how it's always perceived, because there's a lot of unexamined impacts and unexamined experience. Again, let's go back to Lovecraft Country, right? And the idea that who's centered in the conversation, whose story becomes the one through which all the rest of us have to have our story filtered through. Imagine having your story filtered through someone else's experience all the time, in everything, in education, right? In policy, in regulation, in law, all the time. Even when you just relaxing and watching something on Netflix, all the time. You're having to, it's hard not to imagine that you don't get a little confused about who you are and what counts. And then the power that's attached to that. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of good people out there right now really tackling this question, like a lot of you here today.
This is a similar question in the sense that it asks for examples of organizations doing good work. And I don't know that there'll be another one for you, but Anna Wilkins asks, she says that bringing our narratives together really resonates with her. And with Robin Wall Kimmerer's concept on becoming indigenous to place.
Yeah.
Are there groups that are working on the concept of creating spaces where that opportunity can happen, sharing narratives, connecting to a sense of place, and ceremonially all groups becoming indigenous?
Oh,
Because
that's a harder question for me to be specific because I get asked to do a lot of that stuff. So I show up in space that they're thinking about doing that. I would say the easy answer is yeah, there are lots of opportunities. I know that right now there's a group of people who we're that are getting funding so that in 2022 we have a week-long retreat in New Mexico for BIPOC, so Indigenous, Black, people of color who are writing about or thinking about writing about the environment. And I'm not saying this as an academic thing. It's like just across writing in different ways, because so much of the stories we tell are also the stories that are produced. And I think Robin, I know Robin, we might agree on this point that, she and I have been privileged to have our stuff published and put out there in the world, whether you're writing a book or doing blogs or whatever you're doing. And so that's one way those stories get forwarded for everybody else to see and imagine. So I think that there's plenty of ideas of that coming up right now for people. It'll be interesting to see where the funding goes. It'll be interesting to see where how people hold in conversation. The conversation about Indigenous is way more complicated. I will say that 2 Native American women who I know, and we've had this, one of us have had the conversation publicly, Pat McCabe, Women Stand Shining, we call it Red Nation, Black Nation, and the intimacy of right relations, and the complication in this country about reparations versus decolonization. That to understand that Native people broadly defined, who are incredibly diverse, I just want to say, that, at the core, as the first peoples here, and their sense of belonging and place is different than people of African descent who were brought here against their will and worked the land for free. And also assimilated into a capitalist system that thinks about land as having the right to own it, but not historically being allowed to, right? Is 2 very different histories in place. So who is Indigenous? And I can tell you multiple writers and thinkers on indigeneity. It's complicated. I know I was in a recent conversation with an Abenaki thinker, writer, and teacher who said that for her it was highly problematic when she heard a land acknowledgement given where they did the Indigenous land acknowledgement, and at the same time said, and to all the African American ancestors on the land. And she was really upset. She said, because it tells that they don't understand the history of land acknowledgement is something different than a statement about Black people on the land. So even who gets to be Indigenous, how that's claimed and used. A friend of mine, Kaylin Tutree's artist, who's half Lakota, half African American, she's in her 70s, wrote a piece a while ago called Indigenous Mind, that we all have access to this sense of indigeneity and what that means. So even how we use that term is complicated. So I think there are a lot of people out there grappling with that. And I think you're going to have diverse perspectives, because I think it also matters geographically. What does the land demand? And I don't think the land demands the same thing in every place. If we're talking about Burlington, Vermont, or we're talking about Santa Fe, New Mexico, or if we're talking about, Houston, Texas, I mean, it's just different, and what does it mean to be right relationship and know the history and legacy of that place? That estate I grew up on, I always only talk about it from when my parents first got there. So that's where history began. And I know that's not true. I'm presently, fingers crossed, this summer for the first time going to get access to that estate again, in part because I'm doing a residency with the New York Botanical Gardens, and we're working with the Westchester Land Trust and the new owners to gain access to that estate. And I'm working with a documentary filmmaker who's doing a documentary for HBO on trees and people. And one of the main stories she's going to tell is me and my family. And we're working together to think about how do we tell a broader, fuller story. And part of what the HBO director has done has gotten an archivist, and she's already gone back to 1800s for that estate. And that's not even that far back, to try to understand the complexity of, all the deeds were passed through people of European descent. But there was a time before that it belonged to Native people, right? And so how do we hold what that means? What does it mean for me to talk about Indigenous? what does it mean to respect that? What does it mean to be in a relationship with that? How can we not be less? How can we resist the desire to create a hierarchy for those who are most indigenous and those who are not? I mean, what's the relationship look like? I could keep going on about that, but that's a hard one. Yeah.
Thanks, Carolyn. We have time for, I think, one more question, but because you're not seeing the Q&A, let me share.
I see it, but it's really hard. It doesn't move the same way,
Okay.
right? I'm seeing
Yeah.
comments.
Let me just share a couple comments. Rachel Talushkin shared, "This is so beautiful, Anna DeVere Smith. See her work in your." I think she's saying she sees her work in your talk. You brought in so many threads of this topic. They are like the characters she portrays. So that's a comment she's sharing.
Oh, I love you. Thank you for that. That's fantastic.
And Lee Youngblood just weighed in to clarify kind of what she was getting at with asset framing.
Yeah.
She said when she heard you part of your story about were you good at it, that reminded her of this sort of framing that we bring. What does a person bring, and how is it valued? It might be different from what other people bring, and so that's kind of what she's clarifying there.
Okay, and so can I respond to that just to say that's great. I love that. I love that. So I use more woo-woo language, right? And I say, like, what are the gifts we bring? What is the knowledge that's in the room? What does embodied knowledge look like? I think I heard the asset frame. You see where I went to, and I think of assets and money, and I kind of get into this frame. But I love that. Yes. How do I identify that? Yes, there's more I can say, but I'll stop there.
So, and just so you know, I did post a link to the Guild. So if people want to read more about that, look for my post.
Really amazing organization. Yeah.
I'm going to definitely take a look. And then a final question from Barbara Bates. What is your understanding of what people mean by reverse racism, and why do they use this term, or what do you think they're getting at?
Well, that's a great question. I never quite understand the reverse racism because it's hard for me, and I don't like to be disrespectful, but it's hard for me not to roll my eyes a little bit, just at the reverse rate. Racism is about power. And so at its core, it's about power that's filtered through skin color. It's like, if I had to be as simple, it's about power. So to understand that someone white saying reverse racism actually on a level makes absolutely no sense within the history of the United States. Whiteness has always been centered. It isn't to say that there aren't white people who feel they have no power, and they are correct. I'm not saying that that's not true. But in the question of race, again, let me start with the two original sins. All this land was stolen from indigenous people who were killed, placed on reservations, right? And we enslaved another group of people. We didn't enslave, everybody from Europe. And I'm not saying that that the Irish and the Italians and there weren't people who weren't treated poorly. They were, right? But when we understand over time historically how we've codified blackness and brownness, ethnic and racial differences, around, and how in every aspect of our legal life, how long it took before Black people could vote. People would argue that the Civil Rights Act, who had benefited most were women, then Black people. When we understand everything from the Chinese Exclusion Act, we've been doing this stuff for a long time because of race, and always at the center is whiteness. It's always in response to whiteness. As whiteness actually got more specific about what that looks like and who it is. Everything from religion, what we privilege in terms of Christianity, to just how we are expected to show up and be, with each other all the time. So reverse racism, if I'm going to be generous in trying to understand what somebody might mean about that, actually has nothing to do with racism. It's more of reflective for me of a lack of knowledge about what racism is, which I just said, as well as a fear of losing one's place. And this is the human piece that I really can empathize with. That somehow, if I'm not chosen. So, no, I hate using this example, but you know, we hear about students who apply to college and white students and then can use that reverse racism, can say like, I'm not getting chosen because they're choosing somebody who's black or Chinese or whatever it is, right? Reverse racism is happening here. Because I'm white, I'm not getting acknowledged. I think that if you've been fortunate enough to live an unexamined life around the question of race and difference because whiteness has been centered, you actually don't know what it is. You don't even have the language to like understand that when suddenly somebody's pointing to that and going, look, we've been standing out here the whole time in this other world, and now we're saying we're going to disrupt what's going on here, and that can't go unexamined anymore. And feel like that's a pushback. It is a pushback, but it's not about racism because where's the power there? You know, it's a weird thing to feel like it's not that I don't have any power as an individual with 3 degrees in my pocket. You know, I've got some power. You know, it depends on what circles I'm sitting in, of course, you know, but I'm not, this is so hard for me to articulate the idea that my skin color has power at this moment. I have to have this conversation, the ducking and weaving and strategizing and emotional juggling I have to do to get right with it, to come out and say all the stuff that makes me vulnerable, that to reveal it and still be standing upright, to be able to use my experiences of racism as a point of power. It's like, let me show you where I've been bleeding. Here's the limb that got cut off, and it's really powerful because only I can do it because my limb was cut off. Don't you wish you were me? It's like it's like me wanting to say, listen, your fear is real, but you're actually miscategorizing what it is. You're being challenged sometimes for the first time in your life. And so I can imagine that's got to feel like, wait a minute, what? I've been working hard and showing up and doing the right thing, and you don't no, that's reverse racism. And it's like, no, that's not reverse racism. Actually, there's no such thing. What's happening right here is that you're getting called on the fact that whiteness has been centered. You're getting called on it. It doesn't make you a bad person. But here's where self-examination comes in, to understand the trappings of, the place where you've been standing, the privilege of having to live in an unexamined life, that all you had to do was work hard and you did. And it doesn't mean you didn't have loss. And it doesn't mean that you didn't pay a price. But imagine you did all that, and then you're still being told you're not fully human, you don't count as much. We can erase you without a second notice, and nobody's going to pay any attention. We don't have to have any books about you on the library shelves. We don't have to tell any stories about you in the movies. You can fight in our wars and risk your life and come back, and we don't have to hire you because we don't care. We don't have to allow you to live where you want to live. We don't have to give you a loan. We don't have to accept your children. We don't have to love you. We don't even have to like you. And you know what? We're going to be supported. We're going to be supported by history and this moment, right? So imagine that on top of all the other regular human stuff that everybody else has to do all the time. That's why the reverse racism thing is so hard not to get upset about, though I also want to have great empathy for that. My whole thing here is meeting people where they are. Senator James Clyburn from South Carolina, about a month ago, I heard him say this. He's African American. If you don't know who he is, amazing man. He said something about, the interviewer asked him something about working with people across the aisle. They were talking politically. And he said something to me that just stuck with me. He said, if there's 5 steps between us, I'm willing to take 3 of them. So for me, it's not focused on this person who's stuck in this reverse racism. I have to think about my own agency and the choices that I have. And I'm willing to take 3 of them to have that conversation. Let's take off the reverse racism label, because that allows them to remain unexamined, right? They can just pull that out of the hat, and they lose, I lose, and we lose. And I'm interested how we can gain and change. I see you worked me up there with that last one.
Wow. Thank you so much, Carolyn. What a powerful ending. And that I was going to say that was an amazing conclusion, but I want to give voice to the people who can't speak. Barbara Bates, who asked that question, said, thank you so very, very much for this powerful explanation. And Jeannie Lindquist said, bravely and beautifully put. Thank you for doing it yet again. So many great comments. So before Carolyn leaves us, I want to make sure she gets to see all the praise that's coming in and doesn't log out without viewing it. But
yes.
Thank you, Carolyn, so much for joining us. And it was just fabulous and really a highlight of the conference. And hopefully many more people will listen to the recording who couldn't attend live. But there's a huge number of people in the room, and I'm glad they could hear it.